The deep concern that has been expressed by my constituents, and indeed, I understand, by your constituents, Mr. Speaker, about HS2 has finally resulted in not one, but two bills that were announced today in the gracious speech. Now, people will ask, why are there two bills? But the fact is that for the past 4 years, both the last Labour government and this coalition government have spent hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money on a project that has never been discussed or voted on in this House. So instead of relying on a real vetting process through the hybrid bill that will naturally take a great deal of time and in all likelihood will not now be passed before the next general election, the government is in fact going to rush through a quick little paving bill so that it can claim parliamentary approval whilst covering its financial difficulties, not least because the expenditure has escalated without any legislative authority or indeed any real proper scrutiny. In fact, much of this project's development has been conducted behind closed doors, and I think the government must be far more open before slipping through this preparation bill. We all know that there is a major projects authority report on HS2, but I'm afraid most of us have not seen that report. I understand it is a red amber report, which is a classification which indicates that this is a high-risk project. Now, as far as I'm aware, the government has resisted all attempts and FOI requests to have this report published. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it now must do so before this first HS2 bill is introduced. Now, I give way to my honourable friend.
It's my, I may have got this wrong, but it's my understanding the government's bringing forward two bills, a paving bill and a traditional hybrid bill. And I think, is that the right honourable lady's understanding? And secondly, I think we're all going to have to look very closely at the small print of the paving bill, because I think that within the paving bill will be the statutory authority to provide compensation for our constituents who may be affected by this. So without the paving bill, our constituents who may for a number of years be affected by HS2 won't be able to receive compensation.
The devil will be in the detail. But the truth of the matter is that there was no talk of a paving bill until recently, and yet this project has been on the stocks for 4 years, and it is a little late to discover that you need a paving bill. And also, already some of the commentators have been referring to it as a blank cheque, and that is not something that anybody on the Conservative benches would want to see. Now, I, like you, Mr. Speaker, and particularly my colleagues and neighbours, both inside and outside government, and particularly in Buckinghamshire, have serious misgivings about HS2, because this project was produced like a rabbit from the hat by the last Labour government, and it has already blighted the lives of my constituents and will cause irreparable environmental damage to the Chilterns. It does not represent good value for money and will not bring the exaggerated benefits claimed for it by its promoters. Increasingly informed commentators and experts have started to cast doubts on the claim that it will heal the so-called north-south divide, and those doubts are growing. For me, HS2 fails on many fronts. Firstly, it fails on the business case, which is fundamentally flawed, with a cost-benefit ratio that is eroding so rapidly that it's getting to a level where it would not be regarded as worthwhile by any normal criteria. The calculations are based on false assumptions, with the forecasting assuming all time spent on trains is unproductive.
Nonsense.
It also fails to take into account modern communications and working practices. It fails to observe environmental protections. The current plans and route design for Phase 1 and the business case is so conditional on speed that it sweeps everything else aside. The route does not even try to stick to existing transport corridors, but drives a steel arrow into the heart of the Chiltern Hills, deemed so precious before now as to be designated an area of outstanding natural beauty. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. And she will know that Phase 1 ends in my constituency and Phase 2 begins. And whereas, and this is the ironic thing, Mr. Speaker, whereas the route to Leeds attempts to use existing transport corridors, because the government has accepted that at least, the route up to Manchester can't, because it ends in Lichfield and the Phase 1 design was inherited by the party, instead of going with the original proposal that the Conservatives supported in opposition, which would have used existing transport corridors.
My honourable friend makes a long but valuable intervention, and I know how badly his constituency is affected by it, and I think nobody in this House, on any side of this House, would expect either him nor I to take a different position. But it is true indeed that I think that these provisions have come in and just been railroaded through, if you'll excuse the pun, without looking at the detail and looking at the alternatives. Yes, of course.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. Is she aware of evidence from the continent that these high-speed rail systems pull economic activity towards the capital, not away from it?
Gillan.
Yes, I am, and perhaps when we have more detailed discussions on the preparation bill, we'll be able to explore that as well, because it also fails, for me, the integrated transport test. As it currently stands, HS2 does not connect effectively to HS1, Heathrow, or indeed any airport in the southeast. The idea that it should be fixed before we have the results from the Davies report, Mr. Speaker, in 2015 on southeastern airport capacity is quite illogical. It fails the value for money test. The cost with rolling stocks conservatively stands at 40 billion, and there is no guarantee that Phase 2 will ever even be built. This will be the largest peacetime spend on an infrastructure project, and let's not kid ourselves. It will run over budget, and each and every MP in this place should imagine just what that money could be spent on to improve their constituents' lives: hospitals, medical research, schools, broadband, improving existing road and railways. The list is simply endless. And it fails the fair compensation test. Thousands of people, homes and businesses have already fallen victim to these proposals. In the recent High Court judgment, Mr. Speaker, the government's compensation consultation was deemed so unfair as to be unlawful. That's pretty shaming. If, despite all efforts, HS2 goes ahead, compensation must adequately, indeed more than adequately, recompense people whose businesses and homes will be bulldozed along with their lives. I hope at least the property bond will be taken up by this government. Yeah. But I think the department has grossly underestimated the blight this project has and will cause. I think in order to reduce the final bill for the Treasury, this is certainly not where the government should be scrimping on the compensation aspects.
Would my honourable friend give just a brief intervention, Mr. Speaker? I would remind my right honourable friend that the Prime Minister said specifically that compensation would be generous for HS2, and we must hold him to that.
Gillan.
I agree entirely that we should hold him to that, and I hope that he will look even more closely at the proposals that are coming from his Department of Transport. The seriously misconceived proposals for HS2 are a rail enthusiast's charter, attractive to officials in the department and HS2 Limited that see it, let's face it, when the civil service is being reduced, as guaranteeing their jobs, and also the industries that expect to benefit from substantial government funding over the next 25 to 30 years. Advisers are not going to identify other projects that will assist economic renewal because it's just too easy to run with this Labour project. It proposes the highest pace in the smallest place, regardless of damage to the environment, without integration to other modes of transport. By the time it's completed, the business world will have changed dramatically, and this government will have saddled the country's taxpayers with another enormous debt and a white elephant. Having just inherited the results of a spendthrift government, surely we must have learned something. Mr. Speaker, my constituency lies in Metroland, as you well know, neighbouring yours. And after reading the history of the railways, many of the early proposals in the 1800s for constructing new railways suffered from an excess of enthusiasm, which led to failure when the commercial realities became apparent. This is no different. So in conclusion, whilst there is much to be welcomed in the programme announced today, unless the preparation and the hybrid bills on HS2 are dropped, it means, regretfully, for the first time on a Queen's speech, I cannot support a Conservative, or in this case a Conservative-led government, on these provisions. I return to the proposer of the gracious speech, the member for Mid-Worcestershire, who reminded us that even Brunel's projects were late and over budget. But he also said, if it's important and the government is not listening, just keep trying. Well, Mr. Speaker, you and I and our colleagues in Buckinghamshire and the member for Lichfield and many other MPs will just keep trying, and I sincerely hope my right honourable friends will rethink this project before it is too late.
Mr. Keith Vaz.
It is a huge pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady for Cheshire and Amersham, who has spoken very eloquently about a major issue in her constituency that obviously also affects yours. So I shall be very careful about what I say, knowing that Buckinghamshire is in the chair and also has such a powerful advocate. I was going to say it was not an express train, but more a gentle meander through the Buckinghamshire countryside, but one with determination and with huge pride in her local area. And I know that she wrote in The Guardian in January about living through a nightmare with these proposals, and I wish her well in her endeavours. I'm rather surprised that Conservative MPs think that abstaining is regarded as a rebellion. That must put the Honourable Lady for Vauxhall and myself in a very Brixton and myself in a very difficult position, thinking of the numbers of times in the last 26 years I voted against my party, but not that I'm going to do so very often in the future, he says quickly. We'll give way.
Well, gentlemen, you ain't seen nothing yet.
I've seen her with her little dog, and I know that I would not want to take them on in any respect. So I look forward to further deliberations on these matters.
I am sorry that the Honourable Member for Chesham has gone, because I agreed with her so much on HS2. I mean, as a London MP, I know people will say that London will benefit enormously from it. I believe that it's one of these projects that started off as some civil servant's idea, lots of people, lots of engineers' idea, lots of transport experts' ideas, and everyone has gathered around. It's become an establishment kind of project now that no one wants to actually say maybe we've got it wrong. And I hope, as she said, that during the detail of this, that we will actually be able to see that the economics of the HS2 really do not stand up, and that some of the experts who've been giving some of the knowledge about it are perhaps looking at it from a slightly different view than the people who live in those areas, and particularly the idea that it's really going to boost our economy. I have my grave doubts about that, and I think the millions and billions that are going to be spent on that needs to be re-examined.
Now, on HS2, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've spoken during this Parliament on numerous occasions on HS2, and I don't intend to detain the House by repeating again all that I've said. And if anyone is interested, they can find everything that I've said on HS2 on my website, tonybaldry.co.uk/campaigns/HS2. But I note that the government is intending to introduce a paving bill to secure the authority for departmental expenditure on HS2 Phase 2. I think those of us who are not convinced that HS2 is necessarily best value for money in terms of investment in transport infrastructure will, I think, need to be very careful about reading the small print of the paving bill, the high-speed 2 brackets preparation close brackets bill, as I strongly suspect that this will also include a parliamentary mechanism that will enable compensation to be paid to those affected by HS2, and I think the government may well have constructed this legislation so that without the paving bill it would be difficult for constituents to access compensation. And I suspect there will be many who will actually welcome the High-Speed 2 hybrid bill, as this will give those affected by the proposed line the opportunity to petition Parliament and to have their arguments heard in detail by the Bill's Select Committee.
In the Queen's speech was mention of HS2, the high-speed rail service. And in fact, there are going to be two bills. There's going to be a paving bill, which actually I generally support, because the paving bill will make funds available for the compensation for those people who are now suffering from blight. But then we're going to have the main bill, and the main bill is going to be the hybrid bill, which I think will only see third reading after the next general election, which will determine how HS2 will be constructed and where it will be constructed. And I have to say that HS2, as it is presently formulated, is causing an unnatural disaster to Staffordshire. And as we all know, it's causing terrible problems in other counties too, such as your own, Mr. Speaker. It seems as if HS2 has been deliberately chosen to provide a route that can be the most damaging to rural England. And this can't be right. Now look, I'm not one of those people who oppose HS2 in principle. I do not. For the simple reason that the West Coast Main Line, to anybody who uses the West Coast Main Line, will know it is the most congested line in Europe. Anyone who's been waiting at Euston railway station with the slightest problem, whether it's a signal failure, whether it's a fault on the line, whether it's a train broken down, knows there are going to be 3 or 5 hour delays. At least at Euston Station, you're under cover. At Lichfield Trent Valley Station, we don't even have cover. So unless you're sort of under the railway bridge there, you're exposed to rain and everything else while you wait for a train to come along. And that's because the West Coast Main Line is working at 100% capacity. So I do accept we need 2 extra railway lines to connect north and south. I have to say this government did itself no favours in 2010 when they argued that the reason for HS2 is to shave 5 minutes off from Birmingham down to London. That isn't the reason for HS2. The government did itself no favours at all when it argued that spending time on a train is dead time and valueless. A very senior person, I dare not mention his name, in the Department for Transport just said to me 2 or 3 weeks ago, Michael, I see people on trains working on computers. Myself, I just stare out of the window and look at the cows. But the point is, it's downtime. It actually is valuable time. No, the reason for HS2 is because of capacity problems north-south on the West Coast Main Line. So, as I say, I accept the principle that we need HS2. But, boy, could it have been done in a worse way than the way it's now being done? No, it could not. We have chosen a route that carves a devastating line through some of Britain's most beautiful countryside. And the biggest irony of all, Mr. Speaker, is that in opposition, we opposed the Labour route, and the Labour route is the one that we adopted. In opposition, we said, no, we should adopt the route that Arup, their consulting engineers, were proposing, which is to use an existing transport corridor, just like they do in Europe. So it would go up either the M1 or the M40 and then follow the line of the M6 and go into central Birmingham that way and northwards. But oh no, we adopted the Adonis plan. And by the most wonderful trick of irony that we always see in politics, and sometimes in this place, I believe it's now officially Labour Party policy to use that route which we supported in opposition. So the opposition policy, whether it be Labour or Conservative, is the route that I support. Why? Not because I'm being NIMBY, but simply because it's far less damage to the environment. There are thousands of homes currently blighted by the route that HS2 is currently taking. Now, the Prime Minister has said, and I mentioned it earlier in an intervention to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Chesham and Amersham, that the government is going to be generous in its compensation. It has to be. It should be. And we must hold the Prime Minister to account. I'm very happy to give way to my honourable friend, my next-door neighbour from Tamworth.
I'm obliged, Mr Speaker, to my next-door neighbour, the member for Lichfield. He's right to say that the Prime Minister has said that the compensation scheme must be generous. Does he also agree with me that the compensation scheme must also be swift? Because we both have constituents, Mr Speaker, you also have constituents whose homes and whose lives are blighted now. And as much as the scheme needs to be generous, it needs to be swift to deliver to them fairness.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And their homes are not only blighted now, they've been blighted for 3 years, ever since this godforsaken route has been published. I know elderly people who want to downsize, can't sell their homes, are now, you might say, asset rich, but very, very cash poor. They can't afford the homes they live in. They've retired. They can't sell their homes because it's blighted. It is essential that this government is generous and swift in its compensation. And that's why I do welcome the paving motion, because the paving bill on HS2 will, I hope, enable very swift compensation. And the government at the moment is undergoing a compensation consultation package for phase 2. In fact, it's quite noticeable, Mr Speaker, I don't know whether you've done it, but I've certainly responded to the phase 1 consultation, which was very, very tightly worded, and to such a degree, actually, that I, in the end, began to ignore the questions that were being asked because I thought they were completely wrong. Phase 2 has been much more open and much more satisfactory in the way its consultation has been formulated. I've been trying to find out from the government, from the Department for Transport, when they finally come to a conclusion on the phase 1 and phase 2 compensation consultations, will it be the same compensation package? I certainly hope it will be. It would be grossly unfair if people south of Lichfield, and by the way, I'm in this unique position because phase 1 ends in the Lichfield constituency and phase 2 begins in the Lichfield constituency. What I think a former chairman of the Conservative Party and now chairman of the BBC might have called a double whammy. It's essential that the compensation for phase 1 and the compensation for phase 2 are the same. It would be grossly unfair if they are not. This route, as I have said, is blighting homes, as my honourable friend for Tamworth has pointed out. It's blighting lives, and it's blighting the environment. HS2, as it stands at present, is not a Conservative policy in the pure theoretical idea of what conservatism is all about. We need to carefully rethink not whether we need HS2, but how we execute HS2. Otherwise, there will be many people who will think that this government, by adopting Labour's route proposed by Lord Adonis, has betrayed their vote in 2010.
And I would say that I agree with the points that he makes about his reservations with High Speed 2, and would just make the point that just a fraction of that investment, a tiniest fraction of that investment invested in cycling infrastructure could transform the lives of millions of people across the UK. And also, of course, the point that as a South West MP, those of us who are in the South West feel that we could have benefited from a small percentage of that actually being invested in electrification of the line down to the South West and preventing the South West being completely cut off every time it rains heavily. So, but with that in mind, yes, indeed. They say that if you can see across the valley, it's about to rain, and if you can't see across the valley, it's raining already in the southwest at times. But the point I'd like to make is that I welcome almost everything within the gracious speech, apart from those reservations about High Speed 2.